Aden, but I grew up most of my life in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, and I even worked as a female journalist there for 5 years. I believe that you are not born a gender equality advocate or a feminist. You are transferred to that. And Saudi Arabia, it's a good place to transfer you into a feminist. Because I remember the first time I was 13 years old and I was enforced to cover my face. And I wondered why. And I remember the first time I traveled abroad where my mahram, my guardian, had to accompany me, my baby brother who was 14 and I was 20, to protect me. And I remember realizing that all school girls in Saudi Arabia is called after a name. The school of number 15, the school, while the school of my brothers is named after historical persons, the prince or the prophet, and so this constructs your worldview as a woman in such a society. And then when I became a journalist, I worked in a female section, a local newspaper which was segregated. So I remember seeing that wall that segregated the female journalists from the rest of the newspaper. And I was not able to enter to meet my female. I remember also when you become a journalist, you realize how your mobility is very limited in such a society. And I remember attending a conference arranged by the Ministry of Justice in Saudi Arabia, and they denied me access to the conference because all the people who work in the Ministry of Justice are scholars and sheikhs, and they don't want women to enter. Ironically, it's the Ministry of Justice. So I had to fight for that, and they rejected, and I was like, forget that I'm woman. I am here as a journalist to do my work. So all these things make me skeptical when there's dramatic changes. I try to stop there and ask some questions. It was a good start to mention the first women's movement with 1990, with 47 incredible women drove the car in protest to demand their right. Those women, they were humiliated, they were arrested, they faced a horrible smear campaign, they were fired from their jobs and schools. The prince who oversaw this punishment was the governor of Riyadh, Salman bin Abdul Aziz. He is the king of Saudi Arabia today. So actually the first question I ask myself when I see all these changes, does Salman bin Abdul Aziz all of a sudden become a gender equality advocate? Is he a feminist today? And he's a de facto king. His son Mohammed bin Salman is the de facto king in the country. His father is, as many know, is incapable of ruling. So he is actually the person who's ruling the kingdom. So my question is the changes that are taking place in the kingdom are a genuine reform, or it's an act of totalitarianism regime? Does the regime really believe in gender equality, or there are other motivations? I was so happy when I heard they lift the ban of driving car, because I just got all the image working as a journalist, not able to move around. And this is a very important step. But we have to remember all the steps backward, one step forward and all the steps backward, and how to ensure that we won't lose these rights in such a society. I thought maybe I see totalitarianism as a political system that regulates and controls every aspect of public and private sector, and it enforces complete control over subjects. And this is how I see the Saudi case. In order to answer the question, I try to look at the feature of the system in Saudi Arabia, but also I would like to look into different women voices in the kingdom, because women in Saudi Arabia, they're not a homogeneous group. It's a very, very diverse, and see how they interact with the regime. Saudi Arabia, as you all know, it's a monarchy. It's an absolute monarchy. It's an autocratic country that was established by a political marriage between the royal family and the Wahhabi at the beginning. Its legitimacy was based on oil, the system trade horse, tax-free services in return for loyalty. And Islam also has been a source of legitimacy for the country. Therefore, the king is called the custodian of the two holy mosques. So this is intentional, it's not spontaneous. There is not any democratic channels between the system and the people. There is no independent civil society. Of course, there are informal initiatives, and they are incredible. They are trying to exist in such an environment, but there is no any political representation. So 2015, the King Salman came to power, and his young son, Mohammed bin Salman, who you've seen all over MBS, and there was challenges. The first challenges was the drop in oil prices, and this challenge threatened an important source of legitimacy for the royal family. How are they gonna sponsor all these tax-free services in the country? And then you have another challenge, which is the internal power struggle. Now, for all of a sudden, you have a young prince jumping over the succession line, isolating all senior royals, and claiming power to himself. So Mohammed bin Salman is the grandson of the founder. He is not the son as it is agreed on the Nizam al-Hukum. There is no constitution in Saudi Arabia, but they have like a
law of governance.
Yeah, a document. So he's jumping over the succession line. And also another challenge is Islam, because Islam is its legitimacy in Islam start being questioned because with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunis and Egypt, because they portrayed an image that, well, political Islam can make it through power through the ballot box, but why you claiming to be the custodian of the two holy city, why you don't use a democracy like the Muslim Brotherhood? So there was these challenges in the kingdom. And of course, to survive, you use different, as you mentioned, you use different cards. And women issue is one of those cards to serve the political agenda. And if we remember 2011, when there was, during the revolution, the Arab Spring across the region, when King Abdullah, it was so obvious, the royal family, they were frightened. They didn't know how. So the first two things he did was to increase distribution of wealth, to diffuse danger, and announce giving women vote in the municipality, and appoint women to the Shura Council. And it's good. Political participation is very important, but those two roles are they don't have any influence at all. And correct me if you don't think so. But when I talk with the women who've been elected inside the municipalities, they have a single influence. They don't have any influence. So, but I'll get back to that more. I would like first I try sometimes, because I often get the question, how is it a homogeneous group? What is different categories there is in Saudi Arabia? So I try to categorize different groups just to understand what features they have and how they interact with the regime. And then I found a group that is more of state-sponsored women voices. And it's actually planted by the regime. They are sponsored by the system. They wholeheartedly believe in the ideology of the regime. They try to actually delegitimize other women's rights activists. And unfortunately, when I worked as a journalist there, I remember that some of my colleagues who worked in the local newspaper, they worked as an informator for the Ministry of Interior to inform them if there is any intellectual debate that might threaten the legitimacy of the system. And then you have a group that is very funny. It's a chauvinist women group, and they have a combination. They have a combination of an ultra-nationalist element and religious element. And those, sometimes it's difficult to know where they stand. But the only thing that they sure to do is to set up a counter movement to any call for women's rights, any call. And then when the end guardianship system campaign started, they set up a counter movement called "My Guardian Knows What Is Best for Me." Yeah. So, and then you have, of course. It's crazy. And then you have an ultra-conservative group, which is Wahhabi, basically. They're very conservative. They see women in a traditional way. They believe women has to stay home. They should be covered. And there's often the majority of them are like da'iyats, like scholars,
like religious scholars,
female religious scholars. They like lecture in mosque and schools and so on, and they have actually platform in a religious newspaper, a big religious newspaper, and my newspaper was one of it. They write like they advocate for all these causes. And then you have, and they of course they hate the UN and CEDA and all anti-gender equality. And then you have a pro-state group. They're not necessarily sponsored by the state, but they are indoctrinated. I mean, everyone who lived and grew up in Saudi Arabia, you realize that you indoctrinate and then you try to deconstruct all these things and ask questions. So they are indoctrinated by state TV, media, education system, and often they work within the system. Some of them, when I sit with them and I talk to them, some of them, they could be a bit aware of the inequality, but they prefer to not air the dirty laundry in the public. So there is this sort of code within this group. But sometimes they could also repeat the state ludicrous claim that we've heard for years that the society is not ready for change. But I wonder how the society overnight became ready for change.
Yeah.
Is it because of this charisma? And this actually, it's part of constructing this charismatic totalitarian ruler who could make magic. And we have seen over and over again in the history totalitarian regime based on having a charismatic leaders who make impossible things possible all of a sudden. And then the most courageous, amazing group that Rinad, of course, one of them, it's the reformists and activists in the country. And they are the most courageous group because they take a high risk in their work inside the country. They collect petitions, they go to the king and tell him we want a constitution and monarchy. They collect signatures to end the guardianship system. They want to change from within. And as you know, totalitarian is often considered as a modern form of an authoritarian regime because the state in a totalitarian use technology to track down and oppress the dissidents. And the Saudi regime really fears these types of bottom-up calls and bottom-up changes because it goes against the state's ultimate goal to maintain power, of course, and enforcing the ideology that I call Salmanism ideology. And then you have, and then one thing, how the state treat this group. Every time when they announce lifting the ban on women driving, they establish a hashtag called "The King Stand Up for Women." Yeah, exactly. So they try to refuse. The regime refuses over and over again to reward women's rights. Who have been fighting for these basic rights for like decades. And instead, they threaten them and silence them. If you go to the Twitter account of Aziza Al-Yusuf, a very prominent women's rights advocate, her Twitter account was silent the same day the regime lifted the ban on women driving. The same day. This woman, she is amazing. She drove her car. She collected petitions. She presented petition to the king. She was called by the Diwan al-Maliki, the king office, and they told her, you better stop commenting and giving credit to 1919 women's rights activists, because I think many tried to counter that narrative by giving credit and rewarding those women who established this campaign, but the patriarchal system wants to claim that to themselves. So, and this also another feature of a totalitarian system, no autonomous individual or institutional cause demands or whatever outside the state. Everything should be within the state. And then there is a group, I call them revolutionary. They demand the fall of the monarchy. short point, and replace it with a democracy as the only guarantee for equal rights. The majority of those women voices and activists, they are in exile, apparently, because they, of course, threaten the core existence of the totalitarian system. And then there is a group that I feel the urge to mention them, but they're not necessarily activists or voices, but they often neglected and not mentioned, is poor Saudi women. Poor, because, I mean, when I speak on situation of Yemen and Saudi Arabia, I often try to remember my intersectional identity as a daughter of a working class. I lived under what do you call it, a slavery modern system with the kafil system. I was also impacted by the guardianship system and all these things. The Saudi state have a problem to acknowledge and recognize that there are poor native Saudis in the country, because the one you acknowledge that, it means you recognize corruption, you recognize unfair distribution of wealth in the country. So every time the narrative of the state when they address poverty in the country is that it's their problem that they are poor. It's not the state responsibility that there is this gap. And in Saudi Arabia, your invisibility and fragility increases depending on your socio-economic class. And those poor Saudi women are prone to gender violence and to all different forms of violence. And now Mohammed bin Salman is introducing these uncontrolled neoliberal privatization market. And the first one who's gonna fall hard is middle class Saudi family and under middle class and poor Saudi family. And this is taking place in a country there is no independent civil society that can monitor the impact of privatization on people's life. When I look generally of all these categories, I feel there is a common aspect how the state or the regime look at them. They try to all the time to emphasize that all should be within the state, none outside the state and none against the state. This is actually Mussolini's slogan. And it reflects a totalitarian nature. So this patriarchal system grants women some of their basic rights, not because they are feminists, not because they were, but because they are under some form of pressure. And women's situation are used as a card to serve the ideology of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. And even these all entertainment that we see, this fund for entertainment and cinema, it's good. I think people are longing to that. But behind that, it looks very much like the bread and circus policy. There was the empire. Which empire? The Roman Empire. Every time there was a protest, the empire tried to call for circus and share some bread to diffuse the anger of uprising or change. So what are the pressure that the country faced that make these things happen? Drop in oil crisis affected directly the importance of the legitimacy, as I said. So removing some obstacles for women who've been for years, decades unactive. I mean, Saudi women are much more higher. They have much more higher education than their male counterparts, but they are not in the workforce. It's at the moment it doesn't exceed more than 15% women working in the Saudi workforce. So when you do that, you could get them to the workforce. But let's remember, particularly the issue of the car. This is also a socio-economic class aspect. Owning a car and driving a car, it's nothing that can be afforded by all women. Some can do it and many won't do it. Particularly with all the cuts in budget now, I mean, people are losing 50% of their salary in Saudi Arabia. And then there is obviously this power struggle inside the royal family and this anti-corruption movement that sounds amazing. And this young guy who's jumping over the succession line and destructing the history of consensus that kept this family together despite all the inherent contradiction. He wants to survive amidst all these unilateral actions and critics. So he's working so hard to construct the image of a charismatic, popular leader, to diffuse the anger through entertainment, through women's rights, and all these things. So I might add one feature of the totalitarian regime, that they often use violence to justify the end. This was the case with Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and all those people. And I see the war in Yemen is it confirms this totalitarian mentality. It's entering its third year, a disaster, humanitarian crisis impacting all people, and until today you don't understand why. What is the point from the Saudi side to wage such a horrific war? Women also are used as a card to appease allies abroad and to guarantee their support of this new young face. I call it a totalitarian system. Now, Saudi Arabia, the situation is so precarious. All dissidents are evil. It's so difficult to speak. I've never seen such a thing. When I talk dissident, I'm addressing the political discussion. Mm-hmm. If you talk about entertainment and watching movies, it's real. It's okay. But the moment you question why the state wants to impose taxation without representation, then you are in trouble. So now they're planning even to apply 50% taxation on people without getting anything in return. And then you see. So my conclusion is driving cars, voting, members of having women in the Shura councils are great steps, but the challenge is how to turn it against them and keep it and build on it. But I think it's important. I'm of course so happy that my fellow sister and any women in Saudi Arabia get these opportunity. But the problem is that changes that are granted now are a result of a pressure. And what is given under pressure can be also taken away again. Exactly. And this was the case in Tunis, in Egypt, and we've seen that. And in a country where you don't have a civil society, the challenge is how we could actually make magic there and survive. The Saudi women's rights, women's situation in Saudi Arabia in general, really it suffers under a patriarchal clock. The monarchy tries all the time to ensure that women issue remain under the patriarchal system. Rights are granted by the king when he wishes and when he wants, not when people demand them. I think this image of Aziza Al-Yusuf, when she collected thousands and thousands of signatures of people calling to end the guardianship system, and she was filmed when she went to the Diwan Maliki to deliver the list. The officer from Diwan Maliki tells her, well, go back home and send it by fax. So this, to me, features how the patriarch wants to send you a message that you can't impose this on me. It's so patronizing, and then she had to go back and send all the hundred of signature by fax. Lastly, as hopefully this women will be able to drive a car in June, but let's remember that women will be allowed to drive a car, but they will be also Saudi Arabia also will be the only country in the world that allow legally minors person to drive a car, because Saudi women still are considered before the state legally minors, but nevertheless they are allowed to sit behind the seat. So we have a long way ahead there. My name is Hana. I am from Aden, but I grew up most of my life in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and I even worked as a female journalist there for 5 years.